Friends, get ready to hear a real explosion of emotions and reason that broke out on German television. The focus was on Professor Wolfgang Bosbach and a young migrant in a black robe who got into a heated argument about the fate of Islam and migrants in Germany. The young woman, without restraining her emotions, spoke about the fact that the life of Muslims in Europe is becoming unbearable. According to her, it is becoming increasingly difficult to wear traditional clothes, prayers in public places are not welcome, and the authorities, in her opinion, do not pay enough attention to protecting the rights of migrants. But Professor Bosbach turned out to be a man who not only listens to reproaches, but responds to them boldly and without unnecessary diplomacy. His reaction was so vivid and straightforward that the studio literally froze. What did the professor say? Why did his words cause such a resonance? Let's analyze these heated debates and at the same time talk about what is really happening in Germany. Let's start. Germany, which has always been associated with high technology, beer festivals, and impeccable order, has now become the epicenter of one of the most ambitious social experiments of our time. Today, there is a massive migration transformation taking place here, which is changing the country beyond recognition. According to the latest data, between 5 and 7 million migrants live in Germany, but these are only official figures. If we take into account the policy of family reunification, these figures will increase in the coming years. The state offers migrants very comfortable conditions. For example, one person may receive benefits of up to €3,500 per month, which is several times higher than the average pension in the country, which is about €1,200. German pensioners, who have worked all their lives for the benefit of their country, are forced to adapt to new realities. They enthusiastically participate in the great experiment, despite the fact that their living budget is minimal. But for the new neighbors, life seems cloudless. No obligations to work and plenty of free time. The state pays special attention to the resettlement of migrants in small towns and villages. Every week, local residents are invited to accept up to 100 new neighbors. This is a unique opportunity to get acquainted with the cultural traditions of Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan right on your street. Who knows, perhaps in the future cultural exchange fairs will be held in such places. Integration is in full swing. Its influence is especially noticeable in schools. Something unique is happening here. More and more migrant students are actively introducing German children to the traditions of their native countries. So active that even the school rules are starting to change. According to opinion polls, about 40% of German schoolchildren are thinking about changing their religion and adopting Islamic norms. This is a vivid example of multiculturalism in action. Meanwhile, adult migrants are also contributing to the transformation of society. Many of them openly declare that they do not intend to follow German laws. Their arguments are simple. Why follow other people's rules if you have your own, time-tested ones? This position looks very bold, especially considering that there are practically no obstacles in their way. However, in this new reality, not everything looks cloudless. According to statistics, up to 7 knife attacks are recorded in Germany every day. This has become a kind of norm. Women also face increasing risks. About the same number of cases of inappropriate treatment are recorded daily. The government seems to view such incidents as the inevitable costs of a large cultural exchange. In their opinion, these events should not distract from the grandiose task of creating a society of the future. Against the background of such changes, it would seem logical to reconsider migration policy. But Germany, under the leadership of Chancellor Olaf Scholz, continues to move in the same direction. The country is confidently moving towards new heights of a multicultural society, showing the world its readiness to accept the challenges of the 21st century. Social spending is growing, but for such significant goals as the development of a multicultural society, savings, according to the authorities, are inappropriate. Meanwhile, locals are increasingly wondering, how long will it last? Pensioners are already facing the need to literally survive on their modest incomes. But perhaps such problems will seem like a trifle against the background of Germany's global mission. Schools are becoming the main platform for cultural transformation, and children are not only learning new history, but also living in it. Some call it an identity crisis, but perhaps it's just a new era where national borders and traditions are giving way to globalization. If Sharia elements appear in schools, then this is not a sign of crisis, but a sign of progress. It remains only to observe the development of events and hope that German resilience and adaptability will help overcome all the difficulties that this grandiose social experiment brings. In this regard, attention is drawn to an entertaining dialogue between a German professor and a migrant, which vividly illustrates the clash of worldviews and approaches to freedom, culture, and religious traditions. Professor: women who do not wear the niqab are perceived by some people as an object of lust. It's kind of an imposed idea that if I see someone's hair, I supposedly won't be able to control myself. In societies where this ideology is embedded, women are deprived of the opportunity to walk down the street in a miniskirt, and this cannot be passed off as inclusivity or freedom. This is a clear violation of human rights, and it is important to call a spade a spade. Migrant: I'm sorry, but my words are twisted. I was talking about something else. There is diversity in Islam, and each person can decide for himself what to wear, cover his face or not, how to live and express himself. For me personally, the niqab is a form of self-expression and, at the same time, freedom. According to my beliefs, this allows me to actively participate in public life, discuss, be a part of society, and strive to improve it. But bans, for example, on wearing the niqab or on praying in public places, isolate Muslims again. This restriction does not promote integration, but increases alienation. Professor: it is important for me to understand whether people do this voluntarily or under pressure. This is a key aspect for normal communication in society. Migrant: to be honest, it's not that important. If a person wears a religious symbol, there are certain arguments behind it. Professor: but there are often not only theological but also political arguments behind this. It's not so easy to differentiate. Migrant: no, it has nothing to do with politics. This is an exclusively religious practice enshrined in Islam. All Sharia schools agree that the niqab is a normative option, as is prayer. Any Muslim prays 5 times a day. If he is forbidden to do this in the workplace or in public places, this restricts his rights. Such prohibitions not only do not solve the problem of alienation, but also strengthen it. Muslims begin to feel rejected by society, and this leads to isolation and radicalization. Migrant detention: in a country where there are thousands of mosques and houses of worship, where freedom of religion is guaranteed not only to Christians but also to Muslims, such things should be axiomatic. Restrictions work against society itself, exacerbating tension and alienation. This dialogue reveals the deep contradictions and complexity of the interaction between different worldviews. He also emphasizes the need for an honest dialogue based on mutual respect in order to find a balance between cultural diversity and the general norms of society. But this is just the beginning, friends. Then the brightest part begins. Listen, Professor. Then why don't you worry about Christians in Saudi Arabia, who are not even allowed to exist as a religious group? Why aren't you worried about Christians having freedom of religion in Islamic countries? We see numerous restrictions, starting with prohibitions on the Bible and ending with the fact that Christians are not even allowed to set foot on the land of Saudi Arabia. Why are you so concerned about the rights of Muslims in Germany, while Christians remain the most disadvantaged religious group in the world? Migrant: if we are talking about the need to look for a common, not inciting division, then I agree with you. Then let's fight together to ensure that Christians in Islamic countries have as much freedom as Muslims here in Germany. Professor: you describe the war as an ordeal, as a long journey with ups and downs. But doesn't that sound too soft? Doesn't such a formulation romanticize what is happening? Why don't you say directly, don't go there. This is not the way out. This is a tragedy. It would be a clear, honest, and unambiguous position. Migrant: from an Islamic point of view, there is nothing reprehensible in the very desire to escape from a hopeless situation. This can even be perceived as civic courage. But very soon, any teenager who goes to conflict zones realizes that reality is far from the dreams he cherished at home. Conflict is not a place for accomplishment. It is a place of pain, destruction, and loss. However, My task is not to inspire fear or alienate, but to make reality clear. Young people should realize that romanticized ideas about such decisions do not correspond to reality. I always try to be honest to help them see the true face of a conflict where there is no heroism, but only suffering. Professor. However, madam, you seem to motivate young people to participate in these so-called campaigns by claiming that you understand their desire to escape from their plight. You justify this by saying that the rights of young people are allegedly restricted all over the world and that their desire to escape from oppression is natural. Do you realize that your rhetoric sounds ambiguous? Why don't you say directly that such a path is a road to nowhere? Migrant. No, I do not justify such aspirations. I am trying to explain that many of these young people find themselves in difficult situations that deprive them of prospects. For example, one young woman I talked to couldn't find a place to study because of the pressure on her for wearing a hijab. She had family problems, which further increased her isolation. That's what prompted her to look for a way out. She felt excluded from society. But I always try to convey to such people that the reality of conflicts is not what they expect. This is not a promised land, but a harsh reality full of pain and loss. My task is to show that conflict does not solve problems, but only exacerbates them. Professor. But you must admit, it sounds as if you still find excuses for their desire to participate in conflicts. Talk about how they have no choice. But there is always a choice. Society must clearly and unambiguously say that conflict is not a solution, but a path to tragedy. Your words sometimes sound as if you don't fully condemn such actions, which in turn creates dangerous ambiguity. Why don't you emphasize that this is a tragedy that only destroys lives? Migrant. I never justify taking part in such actions. My position is simple. Young people should know the truth about what awaits them. Parents and society play a key role in this. Parents should keep in touch with their children, talk to them, explain the real picture, and provide a place where teenagers can turn for help or support. This is extremely important to prevent radicalization. My ambition is to speak honestly with young people, destroying romantic notions and idealized images of conflict. The main task is to help them understand that there are alternatives, that you can always choose another path that is not associated with destruction and pain. Professor. Still, your position needs more clarity. We cannot afford ambiguity on such important issues. Young people need to be told bluntly that such decisions lead not to freedom, but to tragedy, and that society is ready to support them by offering constructive ways to overcome difficulties. Your words about this being a test are too soft. This does not dissuade, but rather pushes for action. Why don't you say directly, don't go there. Stay here. Fight for your rights peacefully. It would be a much more constructive approach. You say that Muslims in Germany are under pressure, but look at Christians in countries where their rights are systematically restricted, where they cannot openly profess their faith. Why don't you talk about it? If we want to build a common future, we must fight for the rights of all, not just for the rights of one group. These are questions that need to be answered. Migrant. If we are talking about the rights of everyone, then, of course, I agree with you. We must support equality and the fight for the rights of every person, regardless of their religion. But let's remember that the problem I'm talking about concerns those who feel discriminated against here in Europe. We should not ignore this point, because it is important to fight for equality not only in other countries, but also in the reality in which we live. Professor. Then let's talk about it. When we talk about rights, we must take into account that many Muslims who come here initially perceive European culture as alien. We see how every year more and more people find themselves involved in a community that does not always adapt to local norms. It is important to understand that this is not just a crisis for German society, but also for the migrant community itself, who find themselves in an unfamiliar cultural environment. Migrant. But you can't just ignore the feelings of people who come with certain beliefs and cultural traditions. This can be a challenge for both sides. We have to work together to find a compromise and not just argue that someone should give up their culture. Professor. Of course, it is important to take these points into account, but when it comes to social problems, we cannot turn a blind eye to the real threats that we see in society. Germany, as a leading actor on the stage of migration policy, demonstrates a vivid example of what happens when ideology prevails over common sense. Sometimes it seems that this is done deliberately, not just because of mistakes or lack of competence. Germany has already accepted millions of migrants since 2015. On the one hand, it was declared as an act of humanitarian solidarity. On the other hand, the Germans themselves are beginning to notice how their cities have changed. Some areas in major cities have become more like the streets of Cairo or Algeria than the usual European neighborhoods. Migrant. Yes, these changes are certainly noticeable, and they cause concern. But you need to understand that migration is a process that takes time to adapt. We cannot expect instant integration, but it is important to work to create harmony between the local population and new residents. Professor. It is interesting that even police officers in such areas prefer to solve issues remotely, and sometimes they simply do not appear. Law enforcement unions have repeatedly said that police resources are running out because they have to cope with new challenges related to migration. Yes, there are problems with integration, but sometimes they are aggravated by invisible problems within society that are difficult to solve. Migrant. This is a really serious challenge for society. But we must not forget that when it comes to new arrivals, they also face difficulties and problems of adaptation. We need to work on improving mutual understanding and integration. Migration is not just a problem for one state, it is a challenge for the entire world community. Professor, I understand your point of view, but I cannot stress enough that many of those who come do not always strive to integrate into the society that provides them with opportunities. We see how individual groups not only avoid adaptation, but also begin to create their own rules that operate in parallel with local laws. This sometimes leads to riots and conflicts. Germany is facing this problem and must find a way to solve it, not yielding to radicalism, but preserving its identity. The Neukölln district in Berlin, which has long become a symbol of Europe's migration policy, clearly demonstrates the complexity of this situation. Most of its residents are migrants or their descendants, and the crime rate is significantly higher than the city average. This example raises questions. If Germany, the economic leader of the European Union, is facing such difficulties, then what is happening in the less successful countries of the bloc? The answer to this challenge can be found in the politics of Poland and Hungary, which have gone their own way. Poland categorically refused to accept migrants, stating the need to protect national identity. Hungary, on the other hand, demonstrates closed borders and strict migration laws. But instead of studying their experience, Brussels condemns these countries for allegedly violating European values. Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki once sarcastically remarked, "If the destruction of our culture and disregard for the safety of citizens are European values, then we will choose our own path." Viktor Orbán, the leader of Hungary, holds a similar point of view. We are not against Europe. We are for a real Europe, where traditions, security, and prosperity of citizens come first. However, such statements are met with harsh criticism, threats of sanctions, and media attacks from Brussels. Cultural changes in Europe are becoming more and more obvious. For example, in large cities such as Malmö in Sweden or Paris in France, children from migrant families already account for more than half of newborns. If this trend continues, then in 1 or 2 generations Europe will become completely different, will lose the familiar features of its culture and identity. Migration policy also has a significant impact on public sentiment. According to polls, more than 60% of German citizens are dissatisfied with the current policy, and this discontent extends not only to voters of right-wing parties, but also to centrists. From an economic point of view, the situation also looks ambiguous. Germany spends billions of euros on the integration of migrants, for education, social benefits, and other needs. In 2023, these expenditures amounted to about 26 billion euros, almost half of the total budget for social needs. These funds could have been used to develop infrastructure, support small businesses, or improve the education system, but the priorities were set differently. Political scientists such as French sociologist Emmanuel Todd or German analyst Hans Werner suggest that behind this policy is the desire to create a Europe without a clear national identity, but with a single cosmopolitan spirit. It is believed that this will help to avoid wars and conflicts in the future. However, the question arises, will something of the Europeans themselves remain in this new Europe? Summing up, we can say that the current migration policy of the European Union is more like an experiment, the results of which are becoming more and more doubtful. Germany is playing the role of the flagship of this course, setting the direction, while Poland and Hungary chose to stay ashore, questioning the validity of the chosen path. And now I would like to express my opinion. This material causes me a strong feeling of indignation and bewilderment at how absurd Europe's migration policy can be. When the security of citizens, cultural identity, and economic stability are sacrificed to the abstract ideals of humanity and integration, this is no longer a policy, but a direct path to destruction. Germany, accepting millions of migrants without a clear strategy, is actually destroying itself from within, creating a ghetto where its own laws apply, and the police are afraid to appear. This is not integration, this is a concession to chaos, and calling it values is just an insult to common sense. The pressure of the European Union on countries like Poland and Hungary, which are trying to preserve their identity and security, looks especially cynical. Instead of following the example of these countries, Brussels punishes them for trying to act rationally. As a result, we see a degradation of public sentiment, an economic burden, and a cultural collapse. If Europe really wants to preserve its future, it is time for it to stop being an ideological laboratory and return to real politics, where the interests of its own citizens are a priority and not utopian ideas of cosmopolitanism. Thank you for your attention. Friends, I wish you good health. See you soon.